Yep.
Okay. Oh, I got to talk now?
Yeah. Say the brilliant things that you were just about to say.
Well, what I was going to say was when I used an example in my presentation earlier of I went to a basketball game at Morehead State University in Kentucky when I was 10 years old. And I ended up considering Morehead State and actually going there based on that one experience. But I had such a good experience that they were in my consideration set for college. So as I got to know more about them when I was investigating my colleges and whatnot, I ended up going to Morehead State. So what is the ROI of their investment in putting on that athletic event in 1983? And could they have tracked a 10-year-old boy and whether or not that interaction led to the money he spent with Morehead State? Yes, they could if they had been trying to measure the reaction of 10-year-old boys back in 1983. They weren't. They had no connection to me. There was no database. There was no information taken to track my progression. Yes, they could have put out a survey when I enrolled that said, how did you first hear about us? And I could have filled that out. But you can't measure that one individual reaction and interaction and say that, okay, we spent, if you take all of our athletic budgets and chop it down by event, we spent $12,000, let's say, to put on that basketball game. And as a result of that one basketball game, we had 3 people enroll over the course of the next 15 years because of that experience. There's just no way to track that. There's no real way to track, which is why I think with measurement we have to use sampling, we have to use projections and things of that nature. It's never going to be an exact science, no matter how infinitely, minutely you can track things on the web. Is kind of my general point.
Right, and my argument here is that the intent of that basketball game was never to the goal was probably not to recruit 10-year-old boys.
Right.
It was possibly to engage alumni. It was possibly, they were probably measuring whatever it was that they were intended to do. The issue is that, in today's one-on-one relationships on Twitter, can you measure that? And you can measure them in the aggregate, but you can't. You may or may not be able to measure the one-on-one. On the other hand, as I said, my Boingo example is that the 2 seconds that Jeremy Pepper spent talking to me on Twitter resulted in my signing up for 2 years worth of Boingo, which is worth X. So it depends upon. Are you trying to track it back to the actual revenue? And even, colleges and universities are tracking your stuff all the time now.
Right.
If you were going through that process today and you found them on Twitter and then you went from Twitter to the admissions section and whatever, they would have attributed Twitter to your application fee or whatever
Exactly.
it was. Whatever it was. But you're right, and measurement isn't ever about, I'm going to be able to track every single little thing that went into that. That's never going to happen.
Right.
I mean, what we're trying to do is to move people from this notion that I'm tracking eyeballs and that's valuable to at least I'm tracking a relationship with people that is resulting in some benefit to my organization.
Very good.
Buy that?
Very good. I buy that. I guess my the other thing I would throw out there as a kind of counterpoint to that is we spend a lot of money and I think Zena Weist actually summed this up really nicely earlier in a kind of offline conversation we had. I used the example based on some input from someone in the crowd here on that social media really is more about branding and name recognition and exposure and whatnot. It's not necessarily about driving sales, and I think that's generally true.
I agree. I disagree with that. I think you can definitely try to drive sales. I think it's just a question of you can't make generalizations.
Well, and I buy that. I buy that. In some organizations you can use it to drive sales. I think in general, though, to be sort of to kind of craft that a little bit and polish that notion, I don't think you can use social media as a company to walk in and say, we're going to use it for sales, and that's why we're using it, and we're going to make people buy things through social media, because the social media atmosphere, the environment here doesn't allow for that.
Correct.
We see a salesman walk in the door and we're like, dude, you don't do that here. If you want us to buy your product, have a conversation with us. Talk to us. Give us your whole, let us get to know you. Right. Let us get to trust you.
Right.
Then we'll talk about buying your product. But the analogy that I used was, and this is a really good, I think, measurement analogy. Offline, and Zena summed it up really nicely, it's almost impossible to measure things offline. and we're using, in many regards, and I use the example of a billboard. Let's say it costs you $125,000 to put up billboards all over town. It's branding, it's exposure. You have no earthly idea, unless it's the only advertising mechanism you're using, you have no earthly idea if your $125,000 is going to lead to $1 million of sales. There's just no way to track it, unless it's the only advertising mechanism you're using. So with social media, you can track things because it's the digital world. So we can measure interactions, pings, trackbacks, comments. We can measure a lot more than you can in the offline world. But at the same time, if my interaction with Katie Payne on Twitter now leads to me buying Katie Payne and Associates monitoring services for a company 15 years from now, is there a connection there, and do you measure it? Do you track it?
Actually, we do. I mean, we actually do, because your card would go into a database which would say you would eventually,
Okay. Okay. Well.
But that's the advantage of business to business stuff.
Yeah.
Which is that you have a Salesforce database or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. So you have a Salesforce database or something where you can track this stuff over time.
Yeah.
Or you can be like Southwest and have a really sophisticated thing where you track everything all the way through. The problem is that just because you don't have the measurement tool in-house, or you aren't familiar with the measurement tool, or there's not an automatic way to track it, does not necessarily mean it's not measurable. It's that, oh gosh, it's just too hard or too difficult or whatever.
Sure.
But I mean, I'm curious as to, and somebody did say, was it yesterday, last night? I've totally lost track. What happened to sales after somebody started Twittering, and what happened with my favorite brand, the Maker's Mark stuff? I mean, is sales up? Down? You can't separate out on the surface. You can't separate out growth in Maker's Mark sales from the decline in the economy. So everybody's drinking more, drinking cheaper, or whatever. But you put some sophisticated modeling techniques.
Okay, we're going to get going in a couple of minutes here, so let's get settled down.
That's Terry Starbucker being loud. Okay, well, from the Maker's Mark example, we did not set out with the goal of selling more Maker's Mark by implementing social media. So what we measure is relevant to our goal. And our goal was to really engage consumers and give them some more tools to talk about Maker's Mark amongst their friends. Because for the brand, it's much more important for you to tell someone about Maker's Mark than it is for me, because I work with them. Third-party recommendation is much more important to us as a brand, or important to them as a brand. I work for their agency. And so we use social media as a mechanism to give them content online, to give them exclusive information, because the blog that we have for them is on the ambassador's website, so it's hidden from the world. You have to be an ambassador to see it. And so we use the social media techniques that we're using with Maker's Mark to give them additional tools to talk about the brand. And so how we measure that is we do measure online conversations, but and I wouldn't say that. So we measure things like number of tweets that mention Maker's Mark. We do sentiment and tone, so we know positive, negative. Number of blogs that mention it. Sometimes we'll also count inbound links, because search is a little different for a liquor brand, because we don't sell liquor on the internet. And so we measure all these different things, but I still argue that the measurements we have are based on old school PR measurements. They're not as relevant to what we're trying to accomplish, and they're not as polished as they could be. I want us to get better as a measurement community, because I think the brands are going to demand it eventually, but I also think we're smart enough to figure this out.
Yeah. I agree.
Cool. There we go.
There we go.
Terry's going to talk